the belief that we are much more connected to our tenants, whether they be residential, commercial, that we have a more permanent role to play that goes beyond just the term of landlord, just symbolize the long-term perspective that we take in our business. There's no guarantee in a family business that the next generation will have interest in being in the business, whatever it may be. Again, in the family lore, the way it was always thought about harmony within the family is enlightened self-interest. Doesn't mean we don't have disagreements, but at the end of the day, we all work really hard to understand the other's point of view and perspective. What's good for one is generally good for the whole and vice versa. And having that mantra as one of the core beliefs, cornerstones, whatever you want to call it, of kind of how we run the business.
Today, I'm going to be joined by Michael Rudin, the co-CEO of Rudin Management Companies, a fourth generation member of the family, a massive New York City real estate family dynasty. All right. Michael Rudin, newly appointed co-CEO of Rudin Management Company. Welcome to Change Order.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a while since we've gotten a chance to sit down and really chat. I think during the pandemic, we had some video chats, but I was just saying to our marketing person that I think you met me like when I was probably 24 years old. So it's fun to see how the world has changed.
You've come a long way.
we both have. So I wanted to just start. I was doing research for this conversation, and I came across a quote in the New York Times that basically was talking about how, I think it was your great uncle Jack said he hated the term landlord. Why is that?
The way I know the story is, goes the term landlord goes kind of way back, but his belief that we were lords of anything was he wasn't cool with that. And I mean the term landlord goes way back to like medieval times when there were lords and knights and farmers and lords owned land and they rented it out to farmers, and they got the farmers in exchange for the crops or whatever they were growing, got protection from the Lord and his knights. And over time it morphed into landlord. And that obviously then became the sort of ubiquitous term in real estate. And, just this belief that like that was kind of too, I don't know whether the term is like elitist or sort of egalitarian, whatever it is, but the belief that we are much more sort of connected to our tenants, whether they be residential, commercial, and we have a sort of a symbiotic or mutually beneficial relationship with them, and it's not one serving the other or vice versa, and that we have a more permanent kind of role to play, not only with our tenants, but in the city. And so it goes beyond just the term of landlord. He didn't like the term developer, much more of a builder, owner, manager. And again, I think those terms just symbolize the long-term sort of perspective that we take in our business.
Have you gotten rid of the word master bedroom yet?
I can't answer that specifically. I'm pretty sure we're trying to update all of our floor plans, residential floor plans, as much as possible to sort of do away with some of, again, those older terms that were just kind of ubiquitous and synonymous with our industry.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think what's really impressive as I dug into the family history is you all are 4 generations in. And oftentimes, and especially in New York real estate, you see family trees that have split off. Why do you think you all have been so successful at passing the torch and keeping the Rudins in charge of the Rudin organization?
I mean, thankfully, not only myself, obviously my sister as my now co-CEO had interest in getting into the business. Obviously, there's no guarantee in a family business that the next generation will have interest in being in the business, whatever it may be. My sister and I had wildly different paths in terms of getting into the business, but both found ourselves there post-college and have now obviously sort of elevated up to the roles of co-CEO. I think, again, sort of in the family lore kind of, thing, the way it was always thought about in terms of harmony within the family is enlightened self-interest. And Doesn't mean we don't have disagreements. Doesn't mean we don't, have shouting matches every once in a while within, sort of the family, within the boardroom or whatever circumstance it is. But at the end of the day, we all work really hard to understand the other's point of view and perspective, and how somebody else might, perceive or feel a decision or an action that we are making. And it comes down to, again, that sort of enlightened self-interest of what's good for one is generally good for the whole, and vice versa. And kind of having that mantra, if you can call it that, as, one of the sort of core beliefs, cornerstones, whatever you want to call it, of kind of how we run the business.
Do you think underlying that is both A, assuming positive intent, and then B, having a shared core value set within the family?
Absolutely. And again, the values is really important, and thankfully we do all share, the same kind of core values, and belief that, sort of what I was talking to you before in terms of the kind of permanence of our business is it's greater than just one building or one project. It's the sum of all of the parts, and the impact we've been able to have and make on New York City beyond the real estate, and the great organizations that we're able to support, and the civic work that we do, and understanding that, again, it's not just if one building is successful, that's great, or one project is successful, that's great, but you need the neighborhood to be successful. You need the community to be successful. You need your tenants within the building to be successful. And again, it's much more comprehensive and complex than just like, there's a building.
Yeah.
We built it. It's standing. We rented it. Let's move on. And again, that comes with, I think, the long-term approach that we have, others have, but also the real estate industry, New York and elsewhere. There are owners, operators, investors who have a much more shorter time horizon, and I think those kind of longer term priorities and perspectives can get lost with those types of businesses.
I mean, it is amazing because at the end of the day, the real estate business, at least the one that you're in, you have to develop properties. You then need to get those properties rented up or purchased, and then you need to manage those properties day to day. And the skill sets across each of those businesses is probably different. And I remember reading, some quotes from, I think, your father about, your grandfather and great uncle. Is complementary skill sets also just fundamentally important when it comes to the success of a family business, or can you have very similar skill sets in the same organization?
I think it's both. I think at the leadership level, obviously trying to have a diverse set of skill sets is critical. Thankfully, sort of as my dad alluded and has talked about numerous times, at the generation above him, my grandfather and great uncle had very sort of, whether they found those of their own volition, whether they kind of were driven there, whatever happened, was well before my time, but they did have, and then I think it comes down to their personalities and sort of what they gravitated towards, in finding their roles in the business. And that's sort of been, I think a part of every generation after the first, obviously, that has come into the business, has taken the time, had the opportunity, whatever you want to call it, to find their niche and their specialty, and then obviously be well-versed and aware of other things that are going on, but then take the time once they do kind of zero in on something to hone that skill. And, there's obviously the personality traits and the sort of the complementary soft skills, if you want to call it that, but then the kind of the hard skills of our business, I think, again, at my grandfather's level, my dad and cousins' generation, and now at my sister and my generation, we've all kind of taken the opportunity and, again, the time to do that and find where we are best suited, versus being like, you go do this, whether you like it, enjoy it, whatever it may be or not, and having the opportunity to find those right positions and areas.
It's like a self-selecting for something versus being forced or told that you need to do something.
Right. I think generally speaking, it works better in the former, the former setup than the latter.
I mean, I don't think you can fake passion and curiosity, as I've talked about before.
Yeah.
So the New York real estate world, pretty like private, like relatively speaking, not as much anymore with the Real Deal, but would love to hear like what was it like growing up in a multi-generational real estate family here in this crazy city?
It was interesting to say the least. I think, like I said, my sister and I had very different paths in terms of getting into the business. And I think that was intentionally, unintentionally, whatever you want to call it, sort of part of our upbringing and how our father and mother raised us, and how our sort of we saw the rest of our family and how we interacted with the business in the ways that we did. I, from a pretty young age, knew that I wanted to get into real estate. Forget the family business or not, real estate. My sister did not until after college, and again, there was no forcing from my dad or mom or any other family member that's like, you have to do this. If we wanted to be doctors, scientists, astronauts, professional athletes, teachers, whatever it may be, if we were passionate about it, they would have supported us. My sister was a theater major in college and was pursuing that as a career before she got into the business. I, like I said, knew pre-college that I wanted to get into real estate. So I studied things that were relevant to the real estate business. But from a growing up perspective, I knew our father was very sort of inclusive to the degree you can be with children about what our business was about.
Yeah.
Would always go and visit him and my grandfather and just the office and other family members who were there and people who worked for us and that we got to know over the years as children. But, beyond sort of being in real estate, didn't really have an appreciation or an awareness for really what we did. There's the civic and philanthropic side of our family that I was aware of as well. But as a kid, it's sort of just like you're going to events, or whether it be, you just before we started, you were mentioning giving somebody an award at the age of 11, right? That's like, that's not a normal sort of occurrence, but when your family is involved in organizations and institutions that go beyond the business that you're in, you start to see that and sort of appreciate, those things. The marathon was always a big part of our lives growing up, and participating in that, both the start and the finish, and handing out the trophy that was named after my great grandfather. So there were those things which are certainly by no means like a normal kind of thing to be involved in, but were normal for us. And just sort of seeing the city and my family kind of through the lens of how does real estate, what is the purpose of real estate in an urban environment? And again, that's part of whether it's in my DNA, whether it's because I was exposed to it so much growing up, that was part of what led me to want to be in the business, and kind of the excitement of being involved in the city and the success of the city in a deeper way.
I think what's interesting about being in real estate, especially here in New York City, is we're on a fixed island. There's only going to be so many buildings that can even go up on this island, and it plays a huge role in the culture and the people's day-to-day lives. And then you add in the fact that your family has been so deeply rooted in the community. You mentioned the marathon. I think, your family is very involved in A Better New York. So making sure that this island that we live on is very successful feels very deeply rooted in what you all do day to day. What, exposure wise, did you have to that early on? Any good stories where you're like, wow, I remember this, and that really had a profound impact on me?
Yeah. Again, you hit on it, right? It's the idea that when New York was in the 70s, New York was going through a really, really hard time. And that's sort of when I think a lot of the civic work that my family got into kind of took off then. Maybe there were some other things happening in the 50s or 60s, but I think it was just a different, kind of different world, and organizations and institutions that focus on the betterment of life for people in the city were just different. And it was really in the 70s when my grandfather, had to really, and great uncle and other family members had to really kind of buckle down and say, we got to do something here to make the city better and make people want to come back. There was a mass exodus of not only people living here, but companies working here out of the city for a lot of reasons. And again, having this long-term perspective on our business and not being like, okay, we're going to do this building or project and sell it in 5, 7, 10 years, whatever it may be. We can't move our buildings, right? They're permanent structures.
It's not software.
Hopefully they're permanent structures and they're going to be standing for a really long time. And so this idea, again, it comes down to enlightened self-interest. If we want our buildings to be successful, we have to make sure that the communities that those buildings and those neighborhoods that those buildings are in are also successful. And, we're in New York City only. That's been very intentional for a very long time. We have to make sure that our city is thriving if our buildings are going to thrive. If the city's not thriving, at some point in the future, our buildings won't thrive either. It's not an immediate sort of like action that happens when the city's not doing well. The buildings don't instantly fall apart either, or the success of the buildings, decreases. But again, that sort of enlightened self-interest concept of making sure that the place where these buildings are is in good shape is kind of a fundamental core concept. And so, Abney Breakfast, you mentioned the Association for a Better New York. That was something that my grandfather and great uncle started in the 70s. Going to those from a pretty young age and seeing whether it was presidents, mayors, governors, other politicians, civic leaders, whatever it may be. And in the moment, not really having any concept of what was going on, depending on my age, but just being exposed to that and the world that makes the city run or makes the country run. Because there's local government and politics and civic stuff. There's statewide stuff, and then there's the national. And New York is involved in all three. And stuff that happens on the national level is very impactful at the local level and vice versa. And so it's this concept that, you got to kind of be involved and engaged at all levels to make sure that policies that are being talked about and possibly, enacted are beneficial, again, certainly for the real estate business, but probably even more importantly for the city and the community and the residents and the people that live and work here.
So you mentioned that in order for you all to be successful, the city that you're playing in needs to be successful. The pandemic hit. A lot of people were claiming New York is dead. What was going through your mind?
Listen, it was very scary on a lot of levels and very disconcerting on a lot of levels. I'm sure everybody in my family is biased as to the long-term viability of New York City. I certainly never lost my confidence that New York was the place that I wanted to be and that I wanted to raise my family with my wife. That said, whether it's friends, whether it's people whether it's companies you're engaged with or organizations that you're engaged with, whatever it may be, everybody, I think, for some period of time kind of had a thought, a second guess, whatever it was, about what is the future of New York? What is going to happen? The concept of, New York is dead or is going to die, right? My father a lot in 2020 and 2021 reused a line that my grandfather used in the 70s and 80s and 90s at any sort of point of crisis or, period of time where it felt like New York was not doing great. And that's sort of like the quote is like, the obituary for New York has been written many times. And yet here we are. And, are parts of New York City thriving? Yes. Are parts of New York City still reeling and recovering, or reeling for different reasons than from the pandemic? Yes. It's not binary. It's not one or the other. But, we were concerned in those early days of the pandemic, like I think most people were. And on the residential side of the business, through the summer of 2020, there was an exodus. There were a lot of people leaving or looking to get out of leases or, moving, whatever it may be. And it was definitely concerning for our business. But then kind of like a switch being flipped in the spring of 21, whatever it was, people started coming back, and in greater numbers and at, in different ways than they had ever before. And that was a very encouraging sort of moment and period of time to say, like, okay, the office sort of return to work thing hadn't been solved and probably still hasn't been solved. But in that moment, kind of 1 year out from when the pandemic started, seeing people want to live in New York City and still come to, the civic stuff, the all the cultural stuff that makes New York City great, that was very reassuring. Why people want to live here but don't necessarily want to go to work here, that still is a conundrum for, I think, a lot of people. But you got to have people living here first as sort of like the first step. Eventually, I think people will start to go back to the office, but it was a weird time for sure for all.
People just don't want to ride the subway now, Michael.
I don't know. I go on the subway and it seems busy. It seems crowded. My wife and I went to an event Saturday night in Midtown, and we were going home, and we drove through Times Square at 11:30 Saturday night, and it was wall to wall people.
Oh yeah.
Right. It's just like you hear these things like, oh, nobody wants to do anything in the city anymore. And then you go and you're here and you go to, whether it's sporting events, concerts, drive through Times Square, walk through Soho, whatever, go to Central Park, packed wall to wall. You walk by, they're obviously changing the outdoor shed and dining requirements, but like you go to these places that have outdoor seating, like there's a bar on our street. And last night it was, beautiful over the weekend. And he had the NCAA women's championship last night at 3:00 or yesterday afternoon. And was walking my kids back from the park, and every seat on the outdoor component of this bar was filled and people were standing. It's just like, that's what you see around the city. And it's like, the demise is greatly overstated. And people want to be here.
I think it's incredibly overstated, honestly. I mean, you think about since the pandemic, and let's just talk about the venture world, like, a ton of venture firms from San Francisco have moved and opened up offices here. Sequoia, Lightspeed, the list goes on and on and on. And the reason why is there's so many more companies getting started here these days. And it's companies that are getting started with very talented individuals who have the ability to go out and raise a lot of capital from the West Coast. But if they're here and we find them before they do, then, we're going to be able to get that deal. So now they're here, they have feet on the ground. More people then are moving from San Francisco that are operators, which then has, increased rents perhaps for residents. But I do think it's a tale of two cities.
Yeah.
Residential rates high, tier 2, tier B, office space probably going to be struggling for a little bit while longer.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I heard an interesting stat a couple of weeks ago. I won't say who the large tech company was, but it was a large tech company, one of the big 4 or 5, whatever. And somebody was saying that since the pandemic, the city that got the most interest in terms of people who were already within the company pre-COVID,
wanting to move.
The city that was number 1 on the list was New York, of where they wanted to move to. And, again, that sort of goes against the narrative of everybody's leaving New York. Sure, did people leave during COVID? Absolutely. I think a lot of those people were destined to leave anyway, and their timeline probably got accelerated for obvious reasons. But you still hear these stories from companies and individuals who are saying, I want to be in New York. I'm coming out of college. I have an opportunity to move for work, whatever it may be. And New York is overwhelmingly the number 1 choice.
So we're both long New York. New York recovered after 9/11. And I don't know if it was in 2001 or around 2001, but I think you mentioned that you took a semester off school to go and work at your family business. What's the story there?
The story is, I'll jump back a couple of years. In 1995, I had my first summer internship at the company.
How old were you?
I was 10. We were opening a building that we had repositioned. It's called 55 Broad Street. And we had repositioned it into, at the time, a technology-oriented building, which at the time was like unheard of in the mid '90s. I think the project started in '93. We'd built the building in the '60s and had an opportunity to reposition it for this new thing called the internet, which nobody really knew of and had heard of. But we sort of had gotten insight that it was going to become a very impactful thing, particularly for how businesses ran. And so that was my first internship. It was the summer of '95. I was basically like setting up computers and moving. We had one of the floors we had made into, it was called the Digital Sandbox. And it was basically like a precursor or predecessor to the kind of the WeWorks and Convenes of the world. It's sort of like multi-purpose space that tenants in the building could take advantage of for gatherings or seminars or classes or entertainment, whatever it may be. And so I would basically just like spend the summer moving computers and chairs and tables around. Anyway, fast forward a couple of, so that was my first entree into sort of exposure to the business. Again, not really understanding like what we do other than like kind of running this building and this space. But in 2001, 9/11 happens. My grandfather, my dad's dad, who was running the business with his brother at the time, along with my father and his cousin, he had been sick with cancer for a number of years. 9/11 happens. My grandfather passes away 9 days later. And obviously a tremendously traumatic time for the country, for many people, for our city. And we had a lot of buildings downtown. And obviously, as we've discussed, very deeply ingrained in New York City. And 9/11, losing the tragic events of 9/11 and then losing my grandfather and such a, pillar in our family just over a week later was very, very tough for our family. And I had just started my junior year of high school. And it was actually my mom who had the idea of, as a way to sort of cope and grieve and to, sort of just get through everything that was going on, for me to take a semester off. I had to get the permission of my high school, which they granted, and I had to do some sort of continuing ed the following summer and take some classes, whatever, to stay current with the rest of my classmates so that I could graduate in the same time the following year. But this concept of take the semester off, 4 months, whatever it was, go to work with my dad every day, shadow him and my great uncle. My desk was in the room outside of our chief operating officer, who was and still am very close with, and just get a better understanding of what the business is and what the family does. To sort of the point before, I was 16 years old. I'd had that one job when I was 10. I knew we were in real estate, but it didn't really go much beyond that.
Yeah.
And it was, it was a incredible and transformative experience, and probably cemented, again, my desire to get into real estate and subsequently the family business at some point. I probably didn't realize it at the time, but that was probably that, sort of the catalyst for that. And again, it was just, such an unique, obviously, time to be learning about New York City real estate and the recovery effort after 9/11. And again, given my family's and particularly my dad's involvement in the recovery of Lower Manhattan in the 90s, which was part of this story of 55 Broad Street, he was very involved in the post 9/11 recovery and the Downtown Alliance and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council and all these other sort of industry groups and civic groups that were very much pushing for the recovery, not just in Lower Manhattan, but all of New York City and the country, right? The country was reeling at that time. And to go to these meetings, I was going to meetings, I was sitting along the wall, like just listen mode only kind of thing, taking notes, but with, again, mayors, governors, senators, politicians, seeing how people come together in a moment of crisis to put aside differences, whatever you want to call it, political or otherwise, and actively push for recovery and people to come back. And again, whether it was post 9/11, whether it was the stuff that was happening in downtown in the 90s, like I mentioned, whether it was the financial crisis in the 80s. You go back with the financial situation in the 70s, every decade, 15 years, whatever it is, after 9/11, you then had the great financial crisis in the late 2000s. You had Superstorm Sandy in 2012. Then you have the pandemic, right? There's always something that's happening every couple of years that knocks you back or sets you back, whatever you want to call it. And in most of those cases, groups rally together, political, business, civic, et cetera, to make sure that the recovery happens. And so that was, at 16. Amazing. I'm sure a lot of it was like way over my head, but it was very impactful and informative at the same time. And one of the great things that I was able to do, my cousin, who's 4 years older than me, he was a junior in college that year. Had just started his junior semester in college. He also took a semester off. He moved back to New York. We started a charity post 9/11. We took these little apples that I wear all the time. My grandfather had started wearing in the 70s, again, as a way to promote New York and the Big Apple. And we put an American flag on it, a little sticker, and we sold them. These were always given out for free. Yeah. We turned the model a little bit and we sold them, and we raised money to benefit children of victims of 9/11. And so again, you talk about very impactful experiences, going through 9/11 and everything that was about, and the impact again on people that we knew and companies that we knew in the city and just everything. In our business, we still do have a lot of buildings downtown, and the impact that those events had, but then figuring out a way to, help people out of that was, again, part of sort of our long-term business and things that we've done for a long time, but not something that I'd ever really kind of personally experienced at 16 years old.
Yeah.
But sort of to be able to go through that and do it with my cousin, and we brought in all these friends, both from his friends and my friends and everything in between. And to do that was really, really impactful and sort of meaningful in my life.
That's awesome. I remember being in high school, I figured out that A, I didn't like school that much, but B, that I could take a semester off like you and go do an internship, and I could graduate early.
Yeah.
And I did a co-op at my aunt and uncle's company, which at the time was 4 people. They had just won a government contract, and they put me to work under this guy who was a former VC. And that guy put me to work. I had to shred background checks out of the gates, because he just wanted to not have anything to do with me. But I finished the project in a third of the time that he thought I would. And then he's like, well, what do you want to do? And he had 3 new business lines he was launching: the consumer business line, some small business stuff. And I ended up being really interested in consumer. And look where it ended up taking me. I learned a lot from this VC, Rob Chevelle, and I, ended up starting a consumer company and then ended up in venture. And I think it highlights the importance of that exposure so early on in your life, where I guess I would ask you, as you think about raising your 3 kids, are you going to want them to get exposure to something as they're growing up, whether it's real estate or not?
Listen, I think being exposed to having a job at a young age, whether it's scooping ice cream, washing cars, being a camp counselor, whatever it may be, setting up computers in a building, right? I think it's having an understanding of what it means to have a job and have that sense of responsibility at a relatively young age to sort of build those foundational elements, but also, it's just exposure to stuff and things that, again, are in the moment probably totally inconsequential, or you'll have no concept of what it will lead to in the future, but are then part of your story and making you who you are at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And having those experiences, you may roll your eyes and be like, oh, I don't want to go to work today, or I don't want to, whatever it may be. But showing up, doing those things, having that sense of responsibility and accountability, I think is really, really important. And whether it's a job, whether it's service to others, whatever it may be, it's all really important. And I'm sure there's too young of an age to start, but at a very young age, I think it's a very important thing to instill and expose people to. And when you're a parent, it becomes even more, more apparent that that you need to be doing these things. So very much something that my wife and I, do. Our school is great. The school our kids go to does a lot of service days and sort of the opportunity for the kids to get into those things changes. Obviously, as they get older, the sort of younger they are, the kind of more limited they are, obviously, but having those things to be able to do is really important.
So thinking about instilling lessons, when you look back on your childhood or your early career and working with your father, your grandfather, what's one lesson that stands out?
Again, I think I just sort of touched on a little bit. It's showing up. It's putting the effort in. You may not always be successful. In fact, you're probably not always going to be successful. Failure is a part of life and business, but showing up and trying and being committed to something and seeing something through from start to finish, whatever the project is, the duration. You mentioned, getting stuff done early. That's great. Yeah. If you can do that, getting it done, stuff happens, timelines change, whatever it may be. Showing up, being committed, getting stuff done, I think is probably the most impactful thing that I've learned, whether it be my internships during college, the odd jobs I had in high school and before, but just having the commitment to get out of bed every day and go do whatever you have to be doing.
It's 90% of the job is just showing up. You talked about lessons learned from your family. You also interned over at Blackstone, I think, during college. One thing I've always found interesting is that, family businesses tend to be run a little bit differently than institutions. But between when your family's business started and now, the amount of institutions in the real estate world has exploded, for lack of a better term. How have you tried to go about, if at all, learning from the institutional way of investing and the way that they run their businesses?
It's totally different. Just to sum it up, this experience I had at Blackstone, along with the other summer jobs I had during college, was very impactful again, and sort of pushing me to where I am today, or even back then, sort of knowing the side of the business I wanted to be in. Listen, we've run our business in very sort of specific ways for a very long time. I'd say in the last probably 20 years or so, there's been a consistent effort to institutionalize, maybe too strong of a term, but move more towards sort of that institutional level of running a business versus kind of a mom and pop way of running a business, which when you're a family business is kind of certainly how you start, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And continue for a long time, depending on, a lot of things. So I'd say kind of, at least from my perspective, I'm sure there were moments and times prior to me either being aware or certainly in the business that we, institutionalized over time, because I think business has to in certain areas as you move along. But, it's probably the mid 2000s where we started looking at different kind of partnership models for our business with outside investors and stuff like that. And the feedback we were getting from the firms who were helping us do that was like, listen, you guys do your business, you run it well, but there are things that if you want to attract institutional level partners for whatever the project may be, there are certain things that you might need to change and work on. And so it's been a process for the last 20 years. And I think to your question earlier about sort of complementary skill sets, we have over the years, particularly the last, again, it started probably 20 years ago, but really in the last 10 years, have brought on a lot of people at the firm with varied and diverse skill sets and experiences, and a lot of them come from institutional level places to help bring that experience and exposure and best practices, industry standards, whatever you want to call them, into our firm. It's not always a sort of like overnight change in terms of one process to, doing a thing one way and then changing it to another way to sort of institutionalize. But we have made a lot of efforts on that side, in terms of how we run the business over the last, again, it probably started 20 years ago in earnest from my perspective, but has really been kind of highly concentrated over the last 5 to 10 years.
What are the things that you had to change? Fund admin or?
It's processes. Thankfully we don't have we have very few partnerships. Every sort of deal is capitalized in sort of a relatively similar way. We have across our portfolio, I think it stands at 4 today, standalone deals with partners, and those vary in terms of who that partner is and their sophistication or sort of institutionalness. Through those partnerships, and they're sort of varied in tenure or duration, had sort of learned things along the way, but those sort of principles or those processes were kind of applied to those deals versus being applied at the company level or the corporate level. And so it's taking those lessons, then it's taking the lessons that we learn again from the people that we're hiring, bringing in, or advising us in certain cases where it's sort of an advisory type thing, to how do we apply that across the board. We don't have to do a lot of quote unquote fund admin from that perspective. We do have shareholders of our business or family members. So how do we report to them? That's been a evolving thing over the years. Just communication, reporting practices. We have partnerships with public companies, looking at how they report and do things. We don't necessarily have to go to that level or extreme, but there are best practices and there are things that they do that for our history, we're never sort of like, why would we ever bother doing that? We don't have to, we're not required by any, for any reason. That doesn't mean it's not stuff that we should or shouldn't be doing. So sort of trying to learn from, again, those partnerships, those firms that we have relationships with to improve on what we're doing. There's always room for improvement. No matter how good you are at something, there's room for improvement and refinement to make it a better experience and a better process. So we're constantly sort of working on that.
Are there people at other institutions that when Michael Rudin wants to get better, he picks up the phone and calls?
There definitely are. Listen, we have, again, given our long standing, sort of place in New York City, we have a lot of amazing connections and relationships with people. There's people that, whether they've been mentors of or peers of my grandfather, my dad, my cousin, now me, whoever it might be, people that I've worked for or worked with in the past. One thing I tell younger kids who are, either in college looking for internships, just out of college, thinking about grad school, thinking about how do you get into the business, is the power of relationships. And again, somebody you meet when you're in your early 20s or mid 20s, it's sort of just like a social or kind of, this isn't like going to go anywhere kind of thing. But later in life, later in your career, you come back and you reconnect for whatever the reason is. And those, you don't have to become best friends with a person, but fostering those relationships is incredibly important so that when you do need to pick up a phone, when you do have a moment of, I don't want to say crisis, but you do have a moment of needing guidance, support, whatever it may be, a connection on a deal, hammering out or ironing out a deal term that you're sticking on, whatever, and having that kind of human level connection. Be like, oh, remember, you said before we met when, you were 24, I was probably 27 or 28, much younger or earlier in our careers and learning a lot and much more sort of wide-eyed and like what is going on. But, here we are now talking on, your podcast and like, I'm sure when we met in 2015 or 2016, whatever it was, this was not in the realm of sort of possibilities of like where our relationship would be. But, again, it's whether it's, I remember, picking up the phone, we were dealing with one of your portfolio companies who I didn't know was a portfolio company of yours at the time. who had signed a lease with us to take space, and having an issue with the principal of that business and being like, how do I get through to this person? Because they're like, oh yeah, whatever, whoever you are, landlord, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't care. I'm going to do things the way I do things. But there was a need for like that person to understand that like, I was not looking at this as a transaction. I was looking at it as a partnership. And how do I connect with them? And it's like, oh, I do some research and I see that like, okay, Primary is one of their backers. Let me reach out to Jason and say, hey, Jason, can you connect me whether you're on the deal or not, right?
Yeah.
Can you connect me with this person and just remind them or explain to them why treating this as a partnership and not as a transaction is really beneficial for all parties. And so, again, whether it's a mentor, whether it's guidance, whether it's that connection and that sort of warm reference, whatever you want to call it, those relationships are really, really important.
Agreed. I think a lot of that art of developing deep, real relationships, especially early on in your career, is getting lost in this like Zoom world, and it's horrible. But
that brings it back to the fundamental, like, how do people not find value or even actively want to be in an office when you can't? Like that type of connection and relationship, I firmly believe, is not feasible through a screen.
No, absolutely not. I completely agree with you. All right, so let's shift gears for a second. Let's talk about tech. You were an early investor in VTS. You were an early investor in Latch. What have you learned from your investments, in those companies, or in terms of at least how you evaluate potentially investing in a tech company?
We've had a very interesting, enjoyable, sort of eye-opening educational experience in venture. We're obviously, real estate, long-term real estate investing and venture investing are wildly different, but there are commonalities and similarities at the same time. We started our venture investing, well, openly say haphazardly. We were not looking to start investing in startups that were, playing in the real estate space. We started our own startup, also kind of haphazardly. That's still going, but through that process got, sort of between starting our own thing and the proliferation of startups in real estate kind of all happening around the same time, led us to this sort of, this kind of alternative investing in the venture space. We tried to be, or super duper conservative in our underwriting of real estate deals, and how we run our business. That is kind of inherently in conflict with venture investing.
Very.
But the way for us to de-risk the volatility of venture investing was to focus on companies that were relevant to our business. And we stayed true to sort of that mandate or principle pretty well. We did stray away from it here and there. If we saw interesting opportunities that we just thought were cool or unique or, seemed good and kind of on paper. But for the most part, our investments were sort of tangibly related to how we run our business. And so we could leverage our real estate acumen and knowledge and experience in saying, is this something that's going to be, forget us for a second, impactful to the industry as a whole?
Yep.
We've been right, we've been wrong, we've been kind of in between. Companies have pivoted, whatever, and changed their model from what we originally invested in to what they're doing now. The reality of implementing technology is always different than the sort of like the premise or the hope when you start out.
Yep.
I can't speak for other industries. Certainly in my business, it's always different, and that is a fundamental shared experience with any deal in real estate. Any deal in real estate is going to be different at the end of the day than when you first looked at it, underwrote it, did the diligence, whatever it may be. Something's going to change, and generally a lot's going to change. So that's not like a different premise or concept. It's the, a lot of legacy systems, a lot of legacy processes, a lot of just resistance of like, why would I bother changing something? Why do I need to change this method? Why do I need to, whether it's an improvement or not, like, why do I need to change? And listen, at the end of the day, I think sort of we were talking before about institutionalizing or, progressing over the course of a company's history. Change has to happen at some point. Change is not always bad. Change is generally good. It may be painful. It may, take longer than expected. It may be more costly than expected, whatever it may be. But there is a constant need for improvement, right? I said before, you can always do better. And technology is helping us be better or more efficient, make better connections with our tenants, better connections with other people and companies sort of in our world. And so wanting to embrace that and adopt that, we certainly weren't the first. We also weren't the last. We were definitely kind of towards the leading edge, which is sort of, again, how we, originally connected. And, where you were at that point in your career and some other groups that we were working with, it's definitely not simple. It's definitely not straightforward. It's definitely not, as easy as you may sort of hope or want it to be in your mind when you sort of like identify something like, this is a really great technology. I want to bring it into my business. I want to invest in it. It's never as simple as you make it out to be in your mind. And, again, tech companies and startups are constantly iterating and changing and improving their product. And that can be challenging for a sort of legacy type company who is used to like kind of long established practices and policies and ways of doing things to be kind of like iterating on the fly.
Yeah.
That's a general sort of like, I don't want to say conflict, but kind of tension that may exist in sort of the startup versus the customer world. But it's been amazing to see the sort of entrepreneurship, the creativity, the disruption in our industry through tech.
It speaks a lot to the power and the requirement of real ROI. At least is how I imagine it. If you had to stack rank where you believe prop tech has the highest ROI, how would you rank construction technology, the day-to-day operations of your business, the reporting, et cetera, and then the tenant experience?
I think they're all important from an ROI perspective. I think things like tenant experience are really hard to quantify at the end of the day. It's different residential versus commercial, because like residential, you can say like, I'm improving the tenant experience and the rents went up by X.
Yeah.
On the commercial side, if you're improving the tenant experience, you're improving it at like your and my level, right? Which is the individual human level. If you've got really big companies, unless you're doing something like so earth shattering that like everybody in that company is participating in it and finding value in it, and then it's rolling up the food chain, and the CEO or the CFO or head of real estate, whoever it is, like, you've done something so landlord, you've done something so earth shattering that my employees are so happy and thrilled to be here. I want to pay you more in rent, right? Like that. Also, the lease terms are like so long, right? 5, 10, 15 years, whatever it may be. Like the reality of like a tech change that you make having material impact value on what your lease rates are is, I'm skeptical of. On the construction side, right, there are certainly tangible improvements you can make to, how much does it cost to, what are the costs of materials or goods? What's the time to acquire them? Having more precise information about schedules and lead times on things, that's a lot easier of a, sort of calculus to do on the ROI. Day-to-day operations also. So, construction tech, day-to-day operations, I'd say it's a toss-up, right? It depends
more measurable, though.
It's more measurable. It really depends on sort of what side of the business you're in. We don't do a tremendous amount of day-to-day construction. I mean, we're like, there's constantly stuff going on in our buildings. But, from like a new development perspective, we're not the most active day-to-day operations. And so to be able to find something that can tangibly reduce your expenses while at a bare minimum maintaining your level of service, if not improving your level of service or whatever it is that you're providing from an operational perspective. Like those things are really great. They're hard to find, but when you can, they're generally very worth the investment to implement something that has that dual function and purpose.
So you mentioned reducing cost. And then on the other side of the spectrum is the idea of driving more revenue. How do you all make decisions on technology buying at Rudin?
It depends on what the function or the solution is aimed towards, but it has to either help a team internally, right? It has to improve efficiency, improve the customer or tenant dynamic if it's an outward facing thing. ROI needs to be there, but sometimes ROI can be a kind of longer tail, right? Like it may not, it may be a 5-year payback. It may be a 7-year payback. It doesn't have to be a 1 or 2 year payback or less than 1 year payback. I think everybody wants it to be, but the reality is, like in our industry, to make a change that's like fundamental enough to be like providing that economic benefit, it's not going to happen overnight. So it has to integrate well with our other systems and systems of record and back-end systems, legacy type systems.
Yeah, Yardi.
A favorite name in the industry. Efficiency in one regard can sometimes result in duplicity in other regards. It may be really great for a software solution, may be really great for something, but if it doesn't integrate at the end of the day, and you're running that same process 2 times to make sure that the data is in the place that you need it to be, it doesn't matter how great the ROI is or how great the user experience is or the customer experience, whatever it is. If you've alienated the end user of it, it's going to create a kind of a long-term problem. And that sucks because there's a lot of really great technology out there that doesn't integrate with certain things. And we've been in this position before. We've used something for a long period of time, have tried to get the integration to work, have leveraged whatever we can with both companies to try and get them to come together. And whatever the reasons are the reasons, and it doesn't end up happening. And you have to, at the end of the day, sometimes make a tough decision and scuttle the really great piece of technology or software for the incumbent and the legacy thing. And that always it always pains me when those moments happen. And it's happened. Like, why can't everybody just like get along? And why do the like kind of incumbents have to feel like they need to be everybody to everything and everyone and have a solution for everything, usually at the cost of the experience of the customer?
I'll tell you why. Will you churn off of those incumbents?
No, of course, but it's just like it's
it's very like, self-serving because they want to be able to charge you more one day.
Of course, but it's frustrating nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean it's horrible, and it's actually like holding back real estate technology from continuing to evolve and move forward. I want to demystify one thing. When you think about the amount of technology you all have implemented at Rudin, what percentage of the deals, ballpark, do you think started out with a relationship that somebody reached out to you or one of your family members or Neil, or it was an employee in charge of that function who sought out the solution or was reached out to?
Is it just technology sort of across the board or ones that we've invested in as well?
Technology across the board.
I want to say... Well, I have another question for your question. Does the technology have to have been long-term sustainable / successful?
No.
Okay. I want to say it's like 60-40, probably, maybe 70-30. But there's a really good amount of stuff that our employees have brought in and said like, hey, can we look at this, use this, try it out kind of thing? Some that's been long-term successful, others that have not. It's funny, we like in the last year or so, we're working with a consultant now who helps us vet all new opportunities for technology in general.
He was on the show.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So Phil's been really great to work with, and I've known him for a decade now. But when we started working with him, I said, like, I want to know all the technology we use, right, in our company, whether it's at the building level, whether it's at the corporate level, whatever it may be, everything in between, outside of like the legacy ERP systems, or like of the Microsoft suite. Like, if it's technology, if it's software, I want a schedule of it. And so we can say, like, because what we did with Phil is like, Phil, like, let's go through all the existing systems as well, in addition to like potential new stuff. And so going through that list was very interesting, because there was stuff that we use, stuff that we, don't use anymore, but to see kind of to your exact question, like, what is the ratio of things that were pitched, sort of maybe at my level, versus things that an employee brought in and said, I saw this, whether it be at a conference or, a trade show, or somebody pitched me, or our competitor uses it, or, a consultant of ours, was saying how great it is. Again, it's a lot more kind of middle, 50-50, sort of in that range, again, maybe 60-40 than I was sort of expecting at first. But there was a lot of it. And again, it runs the gamut of like some stuff we're using, other stuff we're not. Certain things, maybe they pivoted and changed their product and it was no longer relevant to us. It just didn't work out as we expected it to. We did a pilot and it just wasn't what it was, what we thought it would be. We did a full rollout and something happened, whatever. We changed our needs. It sort of, again, runs the gamut of kind of the outcomes and scenarios. There's thankfully a lot of innovation happening, at all levels of the company.
Let's touch on Local Law 97 for a second. Actually, right when we met, you mentioned you guys had started a company that was in the energy management, building efficiency space. And to give you credit where credit's due, like, you all have been ahead of the curve for quite some time on this, even before the city was requiring things or the government was talking about all these goals. What do you think the other landlords are going to be doing in the next, however many years in New York? Will Local Law 97 actually have the impact it's intended to have?
Maybe. For the sort of last question there, it's literally now, just we're in 2024, which is the first year of getting those sort of baselines in to then potentially have fines come due next year. So everybody's kind of like, for those of us in the industry who have buildings that are based on the original calculations or potentially facing fines, like, this is the final year to get stuff in place to try and reduce those fines. There's a mixed bag, right? It's like there's no one size fits all answer of will it be successful or not? Will it drive innovation? Will it drive efficiency? I'm sure it will. It's just, what's the scale, right? Like, what's the depth of it? Some people are just going to say, the fine's going to be what the fine is, and that's less than investing in whatever the technologies or implementations are, because it's not just. It is very much software and sort of technology focused, and it's also very hardware and mechanical system focused, and it's both. And you kind of need a multitude of solutions. If you are facing a lot of fines, there may be nothing to do, right? You may have a tenant in your building whose energy consumption is so great that there's just no chance, no matter, you could make every sustainability, efficiency oriented upgrade, whether it be, again, technological and software based or hardware and mechanically based, you could do everything. And if that tenant is not willing to sort of play ball and help out, it won't matter. It may reduce your fines if you're improving base building systems enough, but at the end of the day, like, if you've got an energy intensive tenant, you're stuck where you are. So some people may just say, like, there's nothing to do anyway, I'm going to be fined, kind of screw it. Others will say, there's a gap to bridge, if that makes sense. And let's try and do some things. Let's make some changes. Here's a sort of prescriptive path, again, physically, technologically, of things we can do. And maybe the reduction in the fine is good enough, right? Maybe you're still, okay, come to grips, I'm going to pay a fine, but I'll reduce it from X to Y. and that investment is worth it. And then there's others where you can invest and you can innovate and you can improve upon to a degree that you won't pay a fine anymore. And oh, by the way, speaking of return on investment, maybe you're even spending. You're not only avoiding a fine, you've gotten a return on your investment at some point in the future that makes that upgrade even more beneficial and worthwhile.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like all of the above, and it's going to be interesting to see kind of the paths that people take. The company you mentioned, I sort of referenced it before. That was the company that we accidentally started, our technology company. We built something in-house and not a traditional path for at the time, a 90-year-old, whatever we were, real estate company to build a software platform or business. That company is still going well and is out there helping us and others who are facing, whether it be local law 97 in New York or other local legislation across the country. There's lots of it that's either been implemented and voted on or is coming down the pike and will be impacting other cities. And there's a tremendous opportunity for our company and others to make a difference in that, in space of how do owners and operators face these and deal with these issues. But again, also to the point I made, we want to try and help our tenants do better because we're only a piece of the puzzle. We can't solve the issue on our own. We need our tenants
to buy in.
Also.
Last couple questions here. So AI, real estate, any predictions? Will it have a real impact on it?
I think it will. Again, it's, real estate's a very broad industry. There will be certain parts of the industry that will be more greatly impacted by it. And there will be certain parts of the industry that will, be impacted. I think, I don't want to say every part of real estate will be impacted. I'm sure most will in some way, shape, or form. Again, there's always room to improve and do better, become more efficient. Our industry has a tremendous amount of data that is being consumed and digested and analyzed now. And there's a tremendous amount of data, particularly in physical documents, that.
That's why we have an investment in the space because
humans
of that.
Cannot practically and realistically summarize, synthesize, digest, whatever it is. There's, we've started to see some companies in that space. I think, listen, you probably know more than I do, but I think we're very, very, very early in the sort of what is the benefit, the function, the use of AI.
Yeah.
What is the sophistication of AI, obviously, and that's going to change rapidly, I assume, over the coming years. And so are the solutions that AI enables or provides for. But definitely, it's certainly a hot topic in our industry. And again, certain areas are being more impacted than others right now. And that will continue to change and evolve over time as the technology itself evolves as well.
We got a prediction for you. About 20% of development, right, is soft costs. Is that ballpark?
Yeah, it's sort of like between 15 and 25, depending on the.
All right, so we're in the middle, right? I think we're going to live in a world where that 20% drops to 5. Because when you think about architecture, engineering, civil, all these different types of things that go into that phase, a lot of it should be automated in the future. Not all, but a lot of it.
And condensed.
Right. And that actually is really important because in this higher interest rate environment where IRRs are getting crushed and returns are getting crushed, if we can shrink that, game changing.
If you can reduce development time, if you can reduce procurement time, if you can reduce the pre-development time, right? Those are all beneficial stages of the process to be making real change in.
Yeah.
Listen, timing's everything in probably most businesses, but really timing is really important in real estate. If you accelerate a timeline, maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. If generally taking longer is not beneficial in anything. But, if a project that originally had from the time you start analyzing it to the time that it's open, 5 to 7 years.
Oh yeah.
It's a long horizon, right? Just to get a building open. But that's the reality, right? From political, from, potential rezonings, from, the stuff you have to do around your community. it takes then building it, right, obviously is a complex process. So if you can shrink those times, it generally inures to the benefit of the developer or the builder, and generally, I would think, should inure to the benefit of the community and the surrounding neighborhood as well.
I feel like one piece of common advice I hear from people that have lived in New York for a long time, even folks with a lot of money, is that they don't want to buy in New York and they want to rent in New York and buy elsewhere because the returns are hard. With interest rates where they're at today, can anybody really make money in New York real estate buying today?
Are you talking residential or commercial or both?
Broadly, yeah. Like, how do you actually create alpha in this market that's so efficient?
Listen, I think there's a sort of concept or saying whatever, like the opportunity to do well when things are kind of not so great is pretty wide. There are going to be a lot of building, put interest rates aside for a second. That's a huge component of any real estate deal is interest rates, particularly if you're borrowing money. There will be really great buying opportunities at really, really discounted pricing. Mm-hmm. Probably more on the commercial side than on the residential side, given the state of those two kind of segments of the market right now. So if you can stomach the cost of capital right now, that should come down over time. I'm
going to knock on wood.
Right. Should come down over time. And if you can buy a building at below replacement cost, or some sort of distressed amount below what the previous financing was done at or valuation was done at, in theory, if real estate, the sort of general sort of fundamentals of real estate hold true, the next upcycle, maybe 2 upcycles from now, whatever, you should be in a better place than you are today. Yeah. So it's maybe not as great given the interest rate environment that it was the last cycle. But there will be, I think, some pretty real opportunities for people to buy low and in the future sell high.
Yeah. Some folks like Stephen Ross did it pretty damn well during the last cycle. Yeah. So, all right, last one. You wake up tomorrow, you're mayor or governor of New York. What do you do? Any policies you want to implement to improve this beautiful city we live in?
Listen, politics is a sticky wicket for a lot of reasons. I think if there was a magic wand to wave, I think there's probably more. I know there are more, but it's sort of in my mind, there's 2 really big hot button, hot topic, whatever you want to call it, issues: quality of life, and housing. And it's not just affordable housing; it's housing at all levels. There's a shortage, across the board. Certainly New York City. My guess is many markets across the country, and I think the two are really linked and connected, particularly at the affordable level with quality of life and being able to find homes and housing for people at a lower income level. And there's never enough of it. Mm-hmm. And so again, if you could wave a magic wand and instantly create more housing across the board, right across the spectrum of the types of housing, and simultaneously solve those quality of life issues. And again, I think they're connected. That would be probably where I would focus.
Awesome. Well, appreciate you joining me, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.